Hello everybody, thank you for having me here. This is the first gala-style presentation I'm giving. We've been talking about Madonna, we've been talking about Britney Spears. I should have put on kind of a Lady Gaga meat-style suit, huh? Then it would be really perfect. As Steve said, I'm from Wageningen University. It's remarkable that a university with such a crappy name in terms of pronunciation in other countries has become so world-renowned. And I indeed work at the Knowledge and Technology and Innovation Group. It's interesting now, we started as Extension Science in 1964, and I think our name has evolved with how we think about extension and about practice change. We see it as a broad innovation process in which many things need to change, and I very much agree with Caroline that much of the on-farm change, the drivers are beyond the farm level, and that's where you need to intervene and not just true extension at the farm level. Anyway, but that's a different discussion. We're not here to criticize the linear model, also has done really good things. We're here to talk about privatization and then especially about what has happened after privatization. Because in the EU, it still exists. We've had Brexit, we have not had Frexit, so we're still there. We have seen considerable diversity. To some extent you can say, you know, the European Union, or more broadly Europe, I also have a country there, Norway, which is not part of the European Union. It's like the Australian states, different dynamics in different countries, different mixes between what is now private and what is public. So if you look at some of these dynamics, and I haven't listed all the countries, I've not taken into consideration the eastern countries which have entered the European Union later. If you look at some of the Western European countries, for example, the Netherlands and the UK, you see full privatization. There is no such thing anymore as industry or public extension. Doesn't exist. All the providers are private. And the same has happened in the UK. Like Ruth also showed in her survey presentation, they come from different backgrounds. For example, I put a logo there from Delfy, and Delfy is kind of a new name for an old organization, DLV, which in Dutch is Dienst Landbouwvoorlichting, the Agricultural Extension Service, and they made it a little bit more English and sexy. And they privatized, and they became fully private. They had a shakeout from people who could not work in the demand-driven model, but now they have kind of consolidated. And they are independent advisors. AgriFirm, as it says, they are a company also selling goods, inputs, etc. But also they try to work in the best interest of the client, and I think the observations made about the evil nature of agribusiness, I also think they really try to work in the interest of the client nowadays. For example, you also see this thing LTO Glaskracht. You're learning all kinds of new languages in this presentation. It will be great. We also will have Norwegian and Swedish later. That is a farmers' organization who also founded a branch to work in greenhouse horticulture. So a lot of diversity. And if you look at Great Britain, at the UK, well, you have ADES. ADES also has become a fully privatized independent company. So Netherlands, UK, full privatization. But other countries like France, Denmark, Germany, Norway, it has been partial. There's some private players, but also sometimes you still have industry bodies providing extension. In Denmark, that is very strong. Their extension service has always been industry funded. In Germany, it really depends on the different states. Germany is also a federal state, so there's considerable diversity. You see that also in countries where you have full privatization, that industry organizations, if they're still there, in my country, the levy organizations have been voted away, not by farmers, but by parliament 5 years ago. And governments still continue to play in the funding of services. So all the delivery is private, but doesn't mean that it's all paid for by farmers. And that also depends very much on which topic is being addressed. But I will come back to that later. Okay, so here you see this example of Delfy. This is a slide courtesy of Harm Brinks, who is one of the managers within Delfy. And you can see that Delfy as a company, and that's maybe partly due to its origin as the formerly state extension services, they work in a lot of plant sectors. So Delfy is the branch focusing on plants. They also have DLV Dier, which is animal production. They have kind of separated, so you also see has some changes over time, and they have a whole set of areas in which they work. And what is very interesting is that this company, you can see that in this organigram, also explicitly positions itself in a broader system. So they have recognized we need to be connected. And also what is quite interesting, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you see they also have gone international. So that is also maybe due to the markets which they have. We have shrinking number of farmers, there's lots of pressure, declining public funding, less project. So they have also, as a strategy, they've been thinking, well, let's go abroad and also make use of that Dutch reputation that we have some good stuff to offer. Okay, so some of the challenges. So you've seen a lot of diversity. You can't say there's one pattern. But there are some common demeanors in terms of post-privatization challenges in these different countries. So in many countries, you really had a period of turbulence. And I'm not sure where Australia is now, whether you are still in the distrust and fragmentation part or whether you are in the reorientation part. But I'm not sure, I don't think you're yet in the consolidation part. So in the Netherlands, we've also seen this whole idea of like competition, should we freely share? That was quite common in the public system, and it also was seen as a factor of the success of the Dutch agri-knowledge system. But really, people didn't communicate a lot. But I think they have reoriented that system, they have found mechanisms to interact, so it has consolidated. And in other countries, you also see that people are now seeing ways to interact amongst advisors, to also connect research better to advisors. So just two examples. You see on the slide, you see where it says SLU, you see Kompetenscentrum Rådgivning, that's my Swedish interpretation, and you see Kompetent Bonde, which means competent farmers in Norwegian. They are now interventions because they felt our advisors are not interacting enough, they're not sharing enough, and we have a disconnect with research. So they are also in this reorientation phase, but in the Netherlands, I think most of these mechanisms are now in place, so we don't need those specific centers anymore. What we do need in the Netherlands is, because of this private demand-driven orientation of provisioning of advice, it's what the farmer wants, you should deliver value to the farmer, that some issues are not receiving that much demand. Not that farmers don't find them that important, but they're less important maybe than others. So that is when you really see industry and public investment, and they try to mobilize and support the private system in delivering that type of advice. So that can be done with both pull measures, making farmers aware that they need to ask for certain advice, also maybe giving them a financial incentives, and what you could call push measure, you build capacity of farmers to, or of advisors to start a conversation about issues which might be sensitive or not easy to open that conversation, because they might hear from a farmer, why are you talking about that? I'm not asking you for that. But because government has no other means to talk about it, they need to do it through the private sector. So an example of that is the UGCN, which is the Other Health Center Netherlands, and that was a whole intervention around mastitis, which had these push and pull measures. It had also a center for connecting R&D to do service innovation. So that is a type of intervention to still address public goods in a fully private system. Another interesting example, and that was, I think, Elke's presentation. What you saw there is that they were sharing quite a lot in their network. And we did some research in the north of England, where we also found that at the informal level, there's lots of sharing going on, and also people ring each other, you know, do you have an answer to that question? I don't know how to deal with this query from a farmer. They sometimes also broker networks to be complementary to each other, so that they have like an integrated advice with different specialized advisors, not from one company, but really from different companies or independent individual advisors. So that works quite well, but what they noted there, that again there this connection with R&D, because also the research there has been fully privatized, it was just not happening. People didn't have those informal relationships with researchers. So that's why they founded Landbridge, specifically to get more interactions on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, to organize really effective capacity building, feeding the latest insights from science into the advisory system. So those are some responses to some of these challenges which have emerged. The EU also is quite active in this. They have regular projects which address these themes, like, for example, AgriSpin, in which you even have like cross-country comparison, exchange between advisors on issues. And the last thing I want to mention, that is VAB. The VAB is a professional association, but I've heard already there are these types of associations, and they also engage regularly in helping advisors to stay up to date, to build competence, etc. I'm probably going over my time, but everybody's doing that, so so I feel unleashed now. No, I'll try to keep it relatively short. Some of these other challenges continued. Well, if you talk about the criticisms of the linear model, is maybe that it didn't sufficiently contemplate the differences between farmers, the production types, the farm size, but especially the ambition level. Farmers have different ways of reaching their goals. As long as they have a profitable farm, it can be by highly mechanizing it or by reducing mechanization and become more maybe locally embedded. It's all valid as long as the farm stays in business. And we have had some rural sociology professors saying all these highly technified dairy farms, they had a very difficult time because they had so many investment and loans, whereas the ones that were seen as backwards, they were surviving the crisis like that, no problem, because they could keep up with these economic circumstances much better. And so the importance is advisory services need to recognize those differences, and I think with the shift to demand-driven models, that is happening, because you work to serve a client and you don't have a certain normative idea, this is what production should look like. No, if they're happy, if they are surviving, then it's fine. Obviously, sometimes you need to bring in some new stuff, but it's not as maybe as kind of prescriptive as it used to be. So what you see is that there's considerable diversity in farm types, also within sectors, and also ambition levels. Some really want to be on top of the game, others just want to survive, some become multifunctional, etc. And what you see, and that's some research we did in this Competent Bonde project in Norway, that you see different subsystems emerging for these different kinds of farmers. And it would be interesting to see in Australia as that also happen. So you have some top teams for the top farmers with like growth ambitions, and they are very willing to pay for the best advice. They source it locally, internationally, and that's their way of advice consumption. Then there are others who just say, okay, we'll rely on the real sellers, on the input suppliers. We get advice with that. The cost has been calculated into the product. We're happy with that. And then there's some people who are not seeking advice in any way, but still you might have social or environmental considerations to still serve them. And that is where government chips in to still, at least make sure that they don't impoverish and also to maintain the viability of the rural areas. So you see that different segments get a different system to serve them. So that is that Competent Bonde. Another thing which also happened is that, and that was especially in the turbulence time, is that farmers didn't know where to look for the right advisor. And I've heard that also today, and it came out of the survey as well. So they had troubles being a critical client or didn't have the time to be a critical client of advice. Who's best for this particular query? Also, if they change business orientation, where should I go? I don't have those people in my network. So we saw, especially in kind of the turbulence time, we saw organizations like CropEye, Stimulant, Know-Hows, AgroCenter emerge, and basically they're brokers in the service market. So they have a strategic scan with the farmer, they have a talk, they list, what is it what you need, where do you want to go, and who best serves you for that. And then they help to make that link. And they put themselves there as kind of an honest broker. They say, I don't have a preference for a supplier. I will give you an overview. I will list you the pros and cons of different advisors, and you make the choice. But at least they reduce the transaction costs. And we've seen various of those emerge. And some still exist, but some have also disappeared because there's no need for it anymore, because farmers have become that critical consumer of advice, and they know how to navigate the system. Another thing, and that has to do also with this view on that a lot of farm-level practice change is being conditioned outside the farm, and there is where you need to intervene, is that also organizations have emerged to say, okay, are we seeing issues where we need to mobilize others, for example, in the regulatory field, or maybe incentives by the buyers of produce, which are keeping farmers from adopting a certain practice. For example, regulatory uncertainty is notorious for keeping farmers away from adopting. They're perfectly rational, because why invest in something for which you don't know whether it will pay off? And these types of organizations, like, for example, Connecting Agri and Food, they try to make those linkages to the beyond farm level. Okay, some trends. I'm almost there. So what we definitely see, and I think you also saw it, you could see it in the slide of Delfy, is that we have a blurring of roles between R, D, and E. So you see research organizations going more into advice, also because it's a very tight market. But also you see that advisory organizations are starting to do some on-farm trials. They do stuff for agribusiness companies to also supplement their income. Sometimes it's also out of necessity, because they can source research knowledge more cheaply, maybe. But you see that blurring of roles, and an example is also my organization, Wageningen University and Research Center. We started what we call the Dairy Campus, and it's kind of a rebranding of a local experimental station where you have education functions, extension functions, research functions, demonstration functions, all in one. But that's in a research organization going extension. So that's definitely a trend we see. Another one is internationalization. I already talked about the Delfy example. They're in Costa Rica, Poland, Middle East, Ethiopia, Russia, and it's probably also happening with some Australian consultants. But that's part of their business model, to also keep a healthy company. And obviously, one big thing which is coming is the digitalization with the apps, and also new entrants in the market. For example, this Lee livestock precision farming company, it's a startup firm from some Wageningen students, and I think that the incumbents need to take that into account. Will they buy such firms? Will they ignore them and go out of business because they take over? I think really extension should consider what are the substitution effects of apps, etc. Because if the machine can do it, why would you pay for an advisor? What is the role of humans? We know eventually we will all be replaced by cyborgs, but in the meantime, you need to think about it. Okay, then to finish, some reflections for Australia. Well, to comfort you, finding new roles in the RD&E system takes some time, but I think you're doing pretty well with your reflection. I think this is a really useful project, and having these forums is excellent. I think this is something we should have done also in those days. I don't think we did it sufficiently. What is really important is having coordination and exchange, and maybe that is also a role for the industry bodies or for the public sector to foster that, because it's something that doesn't attract a lot of private investment necessarily, or people don't have time for it. You need some stimulus for that, and then really the public or industry sector can chip in. Well, the consideration of the diversity on farms of access to advice and seeing, what are these networks which are emerging is really important, and also have that really well mapped to also be able to intervene if there's some gaps in that. That's the importance of it. For example, I put here this farm style Australia thing. I just found this on the internet, and they are specialized small farm advice. So you already see it emerging, these segmented systems. And obviously, you also already have some sharing going on with this Australian Association of Agricultural Consultants. Maybe they're highly ineffective. I have no clue. I also saw on the news that there's a bit of a row in the accountants professional association. So I hope these guys are not taking very luxurious trips with their members' money from the Australian Association of Agricultural Consultants. Well, I think having a serious discussion about the export value of Australian advice could be good, and making that part of the business models, and really how to create value. I think that's a very key discussion, and the system needs to engage with that. So that's all for me. Thank you very much.